Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into one of the most critical maritime disasters of the 1990s, the sinking of the MF Jan Heweliusz. This was a ro-ro cargo ferry that tragically went down in the freezing Baltic Sea back in January 1993, claiming 55 lives. A really devastating event.
Absolutely. And our mission today isn't just to, recount the tragedy itself, but really to dissect the chain of failures. We want to understand how these design vulnerabilities, decades of maintenance lapses, and some catastrophic operational decisions all converged over just a critical few hours to seal the vessel's fate. We're really looking to understand the technical and operational vulnerabilities that were exposed that morning.
And that timeline alone tells such a chilling story. It's about rapid, unstoppable decay, isn't it?
Yeah.
The vessel started listing significantly around 4:30 a.m. UTC, struggling against these huge waves. But then by 6:45 a.m., barely 2 hours later, the Heweliusz was completely capsized. That speed, going from severe instability to sinking so fast just demands we understand the deep systemic flaws at play here.
Exactly. And the foundation of those flaws, well, it lies partly in the nature of the ship itself. The Jan Heweliusz, built back in 1977, owned by the Polish Steamship Company, or PUM. It was a roll-on, roll-off vessel. Primarily, it carried trucks and railway wagons on its regular route between Świnoujście in Poland and Ystad, Sweden.
Okay, so this brings us straight to that inherent design challenge of ro-ro ferries. These ships are incredibly effective for commerce. We see them all the time. But for those of us, maybe not steeped in naval architecture, why does that efficiency come with such a severe kind of built-in stability risk?
Well, what's fascinating here is the absolute trade-off. You see, ro-ro vessels are designed essentially as giant floating garages. They have these massive, open, uninterrupted vehicle decks so cargo can just be driven straight on and off, super efficient. But that efficiency means those decks lack internal watertight subdivisions, and those are essential for limiting flooding if water gets in. So if water does get onto that main vehicle deck, or, if heavy cargo shifts, you've suddenly created this giant destabilizing pool that can overwhelm the vessel almost instantly.
Right, so the design itself is inherently sensitive, and the sources make it pretty clear that the Jan Heweliusz had been signaling distress for years, really. It was operating within this complex context marked by multiple prior incidents. This wasn't exactly a pristine ship hitting that storm.
No, far from it. And this history is absolutely crucial to understanding the final disaster. Before 1993, the ferry had endured several notable incidents. Back in 1986, it suffered a really serious engine room fire that required significant repairs. It had also been involved in a collision with a fishing vessel at one point, and significantly, there were specific reports from the crew documenting stability concerns when the ship encountered rough seas. They knew it handled poorly sometimes.
Okay, so if we follow the why and how rule here, how did these recurring issues, the fire, the collision, these stability worries, how did they suggest deeper weaknesses? And maybe more importantly, why did they seem to persist without triggering a complete operational overhaul or maybe even taking the ship out of service?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it sort of points towards a deep systemic problem, possibly within the management and the maintenance culture of PUM, the Polish Steamship Company. These events weren't just, isolated bits of bad luck. They were like flashing warning lights about the ship's structural integrity and the whole operational safety regime. They suggest that perhaps schedule pressures, operational demands, maybe they eclipse the necessity of thorough corrective maintenance and strict adherence to safety standards. And that allowed the vessel's overall risk profile just to compound year after year.
Right, this cumulative risk. And then it was thrown against an almost insurmountable challenge on January 14th, 1993. We're talking about exceptionally severe weather here. Gale force winds hitting 35 to 40 knots, that's a Beaufort scale 8 or 9, with waves towering up to 6 or 7 meters. Just a brutal storm.
It was an awful environment, absolutely. But it's really critical to remember that the storm was the catalyst, the trigger. It wasn't the root cause. It was really the moment when all that underlying technical decay became fatal.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. Diving into the investigation findings about the ship's actual structure. How did years of modifications and, let's say, questionable maintenance choices eventually turn that storm from a danger into a death sentence? Maybe let's start with the compromise of the ship's fundamental stability.
Yeah, the investigation confirmed that unauthorized modifications had been carried out over the years. Specifically, things like adding superstructures, maybe extra accommodation or storage areas, that sort of thing. These changes added weight high up on the vessel, and crucially, they were done without properly compensating for the impact on the ship's stability. That was the key failing.
Okay, when you talk about stability, and especially in naval architecture, we often hear this term metacentric height, or GM. It sounds highly technical, and it is, but for listeners who maybe don't deal with stability curves every day, could you break that down? What is GM, and how did its reduction make the Heweliusz so fragile once a rough weather hit?
That's a great question because GM is really at the heart of a ship's immediate survival mechanism in waves. Think of the metacentric height, GM, as the initial measure of how stiff or tender a ship is. Stiff means it snaps back upright quickly. Tender means it rolls slowly and further. Technically, it represents the height of a theoretical point around which the vessel rolls, and it determines the righting lever. That's basically how much force the ship can exert to pull itself back upright after a wave pushes it over.
Ah, okay, like a pendulum that should swing back quickly and strongly if it's stable.
Precisely. A high GM means a stiff ship, quick to recover. But by reducing the GM through these unauthorized high-up modifications, the Heweliusz became tender. It rolled slowly, and critically, its righting lever, its ability to recover, diminished rapidly as the angle of heel increased. The investigation essentially found the ship was, well, pre-programmed to be highly susceptible to capsizing once a significant list developed in those 6-meter waves. Its margin for recovery had been, frankly, illegally erased over time.
Wow. So its basic stability was already compromised before it even left port.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next critical failure point. Watertight integrity. Where did the relentless Baltic Sea finally start pouring into that vulnerable open vehicle deck?
Right. The focus of the investigation here was the stern ramp. You know, ro-ro ferries depend absolutely on those huge stern and bow ramps being watertight. They're essentially the largest doors on the vessel, and they're situated very near the waterline. The source material points pretty clearly to maintenance deficiencies and inadequate sealing on the stern ramp as the probable cause for the rapid, uncontrolled water ingress.
So the heavy pitching and rolling in the storm essentially forced that weak, poorly sealed stern ramp open, or at least caused significant leakage, allowing seawater to just flood onto the main deck.
That's the mechanism, yes. Once the vessel was rolling hard enough in those incredibly high seas, the inadequate integrity of the seals just failed, and water started rushing in. And given the lack of internal bulkheads on that deck, that water spread immediately across the entire vehicle space.
And this is where that final fatal mechanism kicks in, the free surface effect. This term seems to come up in almost every major maritime stability failure, doesn't it? Can you explain that simply? Why does water on the deck destabilize a ship so much faster, so much more dramatically, than water in a properly subdivided lower compartment?
It's the critical difference, absolutely. It's about having water contained versus having it free to move. Imagine carrying a coffee cup. If it's completely full to the brim, it's relatively stable, but if it's only half full, that sloshing liquid makes it much harder to carry without spilling, right? The free surface effect occurs when a large quantity of liquid, in this case hundreds of tons of seawater, can slosh freely, unhindered, across a large open space like that vehicle deck.
Ah, I see. It becomes like a massive shifting waterbed inside the ship.
Exactly, a perfect analogy. As the Heweliusz rolled, say, to starboard, all that water rushed across the deck to the starboard side. This moving mass acts like a giant liquid pendulum that's completely out of sync with the ship's own attempt to right itself. It massively amplifies the list, instantly negating any residual stability the vessel might have had left. This mechanism ensures that even a relatively small amount of water on that open deck becomes a catastrophic, unstoppable force pulling the vessel over. It's incredibly dangerous.
What a horrifying combination. Reduced inherent stability, the GM issue, coupled with this free surface effect from the water ingress. But these technical failures were, it seems, badly exacerbated by human judgment. The storm warnings were severe, 35 to 40 knots, those huge waves. How did the vessel even decide to depart from Sunujisi at all in those conditions?
That decision to depart, in the face of explicit severe weather warnings, that's a major aspect of the operational failure here. It raises really significant questions about the pressure on the crew and maybe on management too to maintain the schedule, potentially prioritizing commerce, the bottom line, over the known safety profile of the vessel, which, remember, they knew had previous stability issues in rough weather. It looks like a calculated risk perhaps, but one taken against very clear evidence of danger.
And then, once underway, even with a structurally flawed ship, maybe proper cargo securing could have delayed the crisis or lessened it. But the sources indicate that the securing procedures were also inadequate.
They were catastrophically inadequate based on the evidence. The investigation showed that the heavy trucks and railway wagons on the vehicle deck were just not properly secured to withstand the kind of violent rolling and pitching they encountered in those 6-meter seas. So as the vessel began to list significantly, this unsecured cargo, and we're talking about potentially hundreds of tons of metal, broke free and started sliding across the deck.
Oh, well. And that shifting weight then became an instant additional factor contributing to the list, right alongside the water pouring in.
It was a direct, immediate contributor to the disaster, yes. Yeah. The cargo shifting was rapid, creating a severe list almost instantly. This pushed the already leaking stern ramp further below the waves, which accelerated the water ingress, which then amplified the free surface effect because there was more water sloshing around. It became this lethal feedback loop. Cargo shift exacerbates list increases water ingress destroys stability. Vicious circle.
And we know the crew attempted to fight back, right? They tried shifting ballast water to counteract the list. But I suppose given the speed of the cargo shifting and the sheer volume of water coming in, they were essentially trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon.
They did try to manage the stability, yes. Shifting ballast is a standard procedure, but the vessel was already structurally and operationally set up for failure by that point. Their efforts were just instantly overwhelmed by that trifecta. The reduced metacentric height, the freely moving cargo smashing around, and the massive amount of water now sloshing across the main deck due to the free surface effect. They stood very little chance.
The ultimate human cost was just devastating. 55 fatalities. That included crew members and all the passengers aboard. Only 9 crew members survived the sinking itself. And the subsequent search and rescue effort. It sounds absolutely harrowing given the conditions.
Oh, the conditions made rescue nearly impossible. You have to remember, this was the Baltic Sea in the middle of January. We're talking water temperatures near freezing, waves still at 6 to 7 meters, just brutal. The international SAR effort, which involved assets from Germany, Denmark, and Sweden, faced these incredibly hostile conditions, and that contributed significantly to the tragically low survival rate. Just recovering bodies in that environment was an immense logistical and, frankly, human challenge for the rescuers.
Looking at the legacy then, the Jan Heweliusz disaster really became a major turning point, didn't it? A potent catalyst for global maritime reform, particularly for ro-ro safety. What specific changes did the industry implement? Recognizing, I suppose, that the very design concept of these ferries needed to be addressed.
Well, the immediate measures were about tightening enforcement. Things like intensified, very specific inspections of ro-ro vessels, focusing ruthlessly on watertight integrity, especially of ramps and doors, and on proper cargo securing methods, checking the lashings. But the big, long-term structural change came 3 years later. The IMO, that's the International Maritime Organization, introduced what's known as the Stockholm Agreement in 1996.
The Stockholm Agreement. Okay, what did that mandate that really changed things for ro-ro safety, particularly in those waters?
It mandated significantly enhanced damage stability requirements, specifically for ro-ro passenger ferries operating in the challenging waters of Northern Europe. Before this agreement, many ro-ros were designed to survive a certain amount of hull damage, like a collision below the waterline, but not necessarily significant water ingress onto the main vehicle deck. The Stockholm Agreement fundamentally changed that. It required both new and existing vessels to demonstrate the ability to survive with a significant amount of water accumulated on the car deck. It directly addressed that lethal free surface effect vulnerability that the Heweliusz sinking so tragically exposed. It also led to strengthened regulations for cargo securing and revised standards for stern ramp integrity.
That sounds like a huge structural change, really designed to prevent this exact kind of catastrophic convergence of failures from happening again. And just quickly regarding accountability for the, systemic negligence that seems apparent. Were there legal proceedings against the management or company responsible for allowing these unauthorized modifications and poor maintenance to persist for so long?
Yes, absolutely. There were extensive legal proceedings that focused squarely on negligence. Charges were brought against members of the PUA management and technical staff involved with the vessel. The courts aimed to establish clear accountability for those systemic issues, the unauthorized modifications that compromised stability, the chronic failure to ensure proper cargo securing, and the overall state of unseaworthiness that clearly predated the final voyage. It affirmed that this disaster wasn't just an act of God or bad weather, but the foreseeable consequence of persistent human and organizational failings.
So to sort of synthesize this whole deep dive for you, the listener, the Jan Heweliusz was lost because it represented perhaps the ultimate convergence failure. You had systemic operational flaws, allowing unauthorized modifications that dangerously reduced its fundamental stability, its GM. You had maintenance failures ensuring water could pour in through a weak stern ramp once the storm hit. And you had operational judgment that resulted in the ship sailing into that major storm with inadequately secured cargo ready to shift. The severe weather simply exposed all 3 systemic weaknesses simultaneously, leading to that rapid, unrecoverable capsizing.
And this brings us back, I think, to the crucial question raised by the source material itself. and maybe the final thought for you to consider. The history showed multiple escalating warnings over years, a fire, a collision, those stability reports from the crew. So if regulatory standards are overwhelmingly tightened only after a high-impact catastrophe claims dozens of lives, how can the maritime industry fundamentally shift its culture? How can it get better at proactively integrating a vessel's entire operational history, the cumulative effect of maybe minor technical deficiencies before they combine? The true lesson of the Heweliusz, perhaps, isn't just about stern ramp seals or GM calculations. It's about demanding continuous vigilance and, crucially, accountability long before the ultimate failure occurs, preventing the next one.
A deeply sobering lesson indeed in risk management, maintenance culture, and accountability. We certainly hope this analysis has provided you with a thorough understanding of the complex technical and human factors that contributed to the tragic loss of the MF Jan